Welcome to Urban Ed-Voyage, the educational podcast that invites you to embark on a transformative journey into innovative education within urban schools. Whether you're passionate about education, an advocate for innovative approaches in urban schools, or simply curious about the possibilities of cutting-edge learning in urban settings, Urban Ed-Voyage is your gateway to understanding the phenomena of innovative education. Join us on this enriching journey and let your imagination be drawn to the extraordinary possibilities of modern learning in urban environments. This week's guest is Gifted Talented Programs Director Erin Yoshida-Ehrmann. Erin has been an LAUSD educator for 24 years. She has had a range of professional experiences, including elementary school teacher, district specialist, district coordinator, district director, educational consultant, and university lecturer. In her current role, she leads K-12 district-wide implementation of Gifted and Talented Education, GATE, and Advancement via Individual Determination, AVID. Ms. Yoshida-Ehrmann is a passionate advocate for addressing the individual needs of all learners, with an emphasis on diverse, gifted learners from historically underrepresented groups. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off by you telling us a bit about your current role and how you got involved in Gifted and Talented Education.
Okay, so I am currently the director of Advanced Learning Options. So that includes Gifted and Talented Education, but it also includes a college and career readiness program called AVID. And so our job is supporting K through 12 district-wide schools with making sure students have access to rigorous instructional opportunities. So my journey here, I've actually been in the GATE office for 15 years. So I started as a specialist, then became a coordinator, and now I'm the director. But the way I got involved with Gifted and Talented Education, like many people in GATE, I started as a gifted learner as a child, so already it was something I was interested in. But when I was a teacher at Coliseum Elementary School, I had the opportunity to work with LAUSD Gifted Talented Programs and the University of Southern California under the direction of Dr. Sandra Kaplan with a after-school program called Project Linking Learning that was a federal Javits grant gifted program, and it really sparked my thinking about gifted education and led me into this role.
Oh, great. So you're the perfect person for this position. But today we're going to only talk about gifted and talented education. Maybe another time we'll learn more about AVID. So talk about our student identification process in LAUSD and how might this differ from other school districts?
So in LAUSD, we are super proud of our very robust and equitable gifted identification process. So a lot of people don't know this, but LAUSD has had a gifted program since 1951. We've been identifying students since then. But in 1980, we actually adopted in California the federal definition of giftedness that includes a lot of different categories. And LAUSD was one of the only school districts in the country to adopt all of these categories, and then what we did was develop criteria and evaluation processes for all of these categories. So we identify in more categories than any state or district in the nation. They're intellectual ability, high achievement ability, specific academic ability. We do creative ability, leadership ability. We have visual arts, which is drawing and painting. And then we have performing arts, which is actually 3 subcategories of voice, dance, and drama. So we're really proud of all of those different categories. And if students are not identified as gifted, we actually have a verification process so non-identified students can participate in our programs as well.
So I'm curious about the creative and leadership categories. I know that they're in the federal definitions per the Elementary and Secondary Act, but can you talk a little bit more about that? Because a lot of folks don't really know what that means.
Absolutely. So in the creative ability, these would be students who demonstrate things like convergent or divergent thinking. They're students that demonstrate novel ideas. They want to create novel products. That's how they demonstrate their understanding of the world. For leadership ability, these are students that are really passionate about things like social justice. They're the ones that are driven by the need to help others. Dr. Goldie Mohammed calls this criticality. So students that are really invested in the world around them and making sure that they are a part of making the world a better place. In my classroom, I always called those kids the injustice detectors because they were able to tell you what was fair, what wasn't fair, and all of their actions were guided by their ethics. So those two categories, we identify them in, and we've been doing it since, again, 1980. So these aren't new categories. When people say, "Oh, when did you add these categories?" We added them in 1980, before a lot of the people were even born. But these are very robust categories where students have to go through a portfolio process where we have students demonstrate that they are, markedly advanced in relation to their chronological peers in terms of this creativity and leadership. And we look at the potential for these areas, but we also look at sort of what they've actually done with these skills as well. So they can't just be a part of student government. They actually have to really do something with it.
Great. You talked specifically about some of the behaviors and demonstrations for our creative and leadership students. How about just more generally speaking of our gifted students? I was also a gifted teacher, and I remember some of my kids had a quirky sense of humor. They're all about justice. What are some other type of demonstrations?
Yeah, so I love this question because I think so many times people conflate giftedness with high achievement, and many of our gifted learners are not necessarily high-achieving students yet. That's our job as educators to make sure they get there. So a lot of these students have academic and social emotional needs that are very different than their peers. In terms of social emotional needs, they may demonstrate asynchrony. So they have uneven development where they're really strong in one area and not in another. We have students that are, English learners or multilingual learners who are also gifted. We have a lot of underrepresented groups. Some of these are able underachieving students who are very gifted, but they're not necessarily performing at high levels. We have students with disabilities, multiple disabilities that are also gifted. We call these our twice exceptional learners. And then in terms of some additional social emotional needs, these students have the tendency to experience things at a heightened level. So they have a heightened reaction to stimuli compared to their regular chronological peers. We call these intensities or overexcitabilities. And these really affect how they experience the world. And it may result in things like anxiety, depression, the existential crises that they may have at a young age because they are thinking about things at a very different level than others. And all of those different things, all of those sort of academic and social emotional needs, they come through in the classroom and they impact a student's ability to learn, which is why our job as teachers and also our job as parents is making sure we're providing these safe learning environments for them to really understand themselves as learners and develop what we call scholarly traits or scholarly identities, so they realize that being gifted is not a guarantee to doing well. When you're gifted, it means that you still have to put in hard work. It means you're still going to struggle and hit challenges. But that's the magic in learning, is being able to experience those things and power through them, push through them, because that's where the true learning and critical thinking happens. So that was a very long answer to your kind of short question. But all that to say, there's no one right way to be a gifted learner. And I will say this, if you're a teacher of gifted learners and your class is easy, then you may need to go back to your principal and talk about clustering, because you may only have the high-achieving students in your class or those that are demonstrating appropriate classroom behavior. If you are teaching a truly equitable GATE classroom, you are going to have an extremely challenging classroom. These kids are going to push you beyond your limits, beyond their limits, and it's going to be a really exciting place, but it's not going to be an easy teaching situation. So this is why we have our GATE programs, is to advocate for these very unique types of learners.
And I remember when I was a gifted teacher that I had a number of students who had divergent interests, and sometimes that caused some issues with them socially. Did you experience any of that when you were a teacher?
Absolutely, and I have two middle schoolers myself, and I see it. So there are sort of two ways that I tend to see this with students. One is that they have so many interests that they, can't really focus on one thing. They love dabbling, so they'll try one thing, move on to the next thing over and over and over again, and can't really focus on the one. There are the other students that have like sort of an obsession or an intense interest in one particular thing, and that's all they want to think about, talk about, learn about. So when we see these things, we have to make sure we know what types of learners we have in our classroom. We want them to identify these characteristics in themselves, so making sure they have that metacognition piece, and then building in learning opportunities, scaffolds, systems in the classroom so they can take those types of learning needs and learning styles and bring their interests into the classroom so they can actually access standards-based adopted curriculum in a way that is interesting or relevant to them.
Okay. Simply, every child deserves to be challenged.
Absolutely. And a lot of people don't see this where they think that gifted learners are like the special helper in the class, or every class should have one gifted learner. But gifted learners deserve to learn something new every day, just like every other student. And a lot of our gifted learners, especially our high-achieving students, are going to come to a class already knowing a lot of the things that the teachers are planning to teach. So it's our job as practitioners in the classroom to really look at our students, observe our students, use data to make sure that they are, receiving differentiated instruction and learning something new every day, not just going through the same curriculum that everybody's going through because that's what's on the pacing plan for that day, but really knowing when you can compact curriculum for a student and move them on to something that is more challenging.
Okay, not just give them more work. I'm kidding. So what I learned was that a lot of the gifted learners appreciated the whole idea of like choice or selection of activities or autonomy. They presented with an internal locus of control, and they wanted to demonstrate that. And so as a teacher, it was important for me to provide them with, I called it a learning agenda, with a lot of different types of activities at a lot of different levels, and have them select that. And I hope I did the right thing.
Absolutely. I think one great way to do that, a sort of simple way for teachers to do that, is through novel products where students can demonstrate their mastery in multiple ways. It's not like saying, we've done this lesson and everybody has to do this exact same product to show that they've learned it, but give students choice with a variety of novel products based on their own learning style, based on their own interest. Because I think that's an important way to give, like you said, our students some autonomy in the classroom.
Okay, so what is this whole think like a disciplinarian and think like a scientist, and what is all that about?
All right, so Think Like a Disciplinarian was a strategy created by Dr. Sandra Kaplan at USC, and it's really the idea that students, when you're in the classroom, the math book isn't math, if that makes sense. We want our students to think as mathematicians. So we want them to embrace the tools and the language and the methodology of the disciplinarian or the practitioner. So when they're going through learning experiences, for example, if it's like project-based learning or an independent study project, they're actually doing math, doing science as the practitioner. That's the only way they can really learn, if they're really learning as the disciplinarian. So I hope that makes sense, because a lot of times we'll go through the math book pages, but that's not what a mathematician does. A mathematician actually go through the process of mathematical thinking. So I just think that's really important to give our students the opportunity to think as a disciplinarian, so they realize that when they're in math class, they're not just doing math because it's time to do math in math class. They're doing math because they are mathematicians, and these mathematical skills and processes are things that they should be using in their real life.
So how are we preparing our teachers for this, to facilitate this type of learning?
I'm glad you're asking that. So one of my favorite things about this job is professional development. So Gifted Talented Programs offers so much professional development to our leaders, our educators, our families, and now even our students through our Gifted Student Advisory Council. So we provide so much professional development in terms of salary point courses. We do online courses. We go out to school sites. We have large-scale events. And it's really focused on equitable access to gifted programs. And then we really dig deep into a lot of the instructional strategies for gifted learners, how to take that adopted curriculum and really embed the tenets of depth, complexity, novelty, and acceleration. So teachers feel like they know their curriculum, they know their standards, but they also know their students. And they are okay to modify their curriculum a bit to match the needs of their students. And so, last year, LAUSD Gifted Talented Programs trained 22,000 people in gifted education, and that number keeps growing because there is a lot of interest out there. And I think once people take our professional development courses, they realize that this is the light bulb moment that they needed. They have their adopted curriculum, they know their standards, but how can they actually make it work for the students in their class?
Okay, I need you to define a couple of terms for our audience. And you mentioned some of our schools or teachers utilize clustering of students. What does that mean?
Yeah, so gate clustering means you intentionally put our gifted learners together for instruction. So in our district, our clustering requirement is that at the elementary level, you're going to have a minimum of 5 gifted students in a gate class. At the secondary level, that may be like an honors or AP, you're going to have a minimum of 15 gifted learners in a class because gifted learners need to work with other gifted learners. That's just the bottom line. They need the opportunity to work with other students who think like them, who think differently than them, who are working, at higher levels, so they can be pushed. If we don't cluster our gifted learners together, 2 things happen. One thing is that the students will not have an intellectual peer group to work with, and so they can either end up doing all the work and becoming resentful, or they become able underachieving students because they realize that they aren't going to be pushed. They're going to be, they're going to be fine either way. The other piece is not the student piece, but the teacher piece. Like I know from being a teacher, it is impossible to differentiate for all the different levels in your class. If you have one, let's say one highly gifted or high achieving student and the rest of your students are struggling, sometimes that high achieving student is not going to get their needs met. They are going to be sitting through that whole group lesson because the teacher is trying to meet the needs of all of the other learners in their class. So in order to really meet the needs of the students, but also make this sort of realistic and effective for teachers, we have to cluster our gifted learners together. So I want to clarify, though, that gifted clustering is not the same thing as tracking. So tracking is when you would put, let's say you pre-assess before a grade level and you put all your gifted learners in the same class and then you track them together where they move together through grade levels and there's no getting in or off, of that train. That's not appropriate. That's tracking and that's not equitable for our students. So we believe in constantly looking at data, making sure we're continually bringing students into those clusters who need that type of rigorous instruction.
Okay, and what is a twice exceptional?
So twice exceptional refers to students who are gifted but have some sort of special need or disability. And so they have multiple exceptionalities. And what we want our teachers to know is that all of those needs need to be met. So you're not going to, ignore one and focus on another. And what we find is with a lot of our twice exceptional students, their giftedness could mask their special needs or their special need could mask their giftedness. And so it is sort of hard sometimes to identify these students, but they need all of those needs met. And so we're really fortunate that Gifted Talented Programs is under the same umbrella with the Division of Special Education and Specialized Programs. So we can partner with our colleagues in the Division of Special Education to make sure we're providing these inclusive environments and differentiated instructional supports for our twice exceptional learners.
Great. And so what are we doing to ensure equitable access to our gifted education for historically marginalized students?
So this is the foundation of everything we do in our office and has been. So again, I've been in Gifted Talented Programs for 15 years, but this was happening long before I ever started in this office. So know that. This isn't something we started. We've historically had a culture of equity in Gifted Talented Programs in LAUSD, and we're very proud of that. So we do a lot of things, but I'll give you sort of the high-level examples. We are one of the only large urban school districts to do a universal screening assessment. So we test every single second grader in LAUSD with an aptitude assessment called the LSAT 8 that is 100% pictorial. It can be administered in a student's primary language. And it has no, sort of like reading or writing or basic math, but we're really looking for students who have these sort of cognitive abilities and this potential to perform well in school. So we love that we use the LSAT 8 as this universal screening assessment, but it's really not the only assessment that we do. And again, as a reminder, we identify for giftedness K through 12. Gifted identification does not start in second grade with the LSAT 8. It starts in kindergarten with intellectual ability. So another thing we do for equitable access, we have something called the Targeted Identification Program, or TIP. We started this in 2008. And what we do is we use data every single year to reach in and support schools that are low referring, low identifying, or are high identifying with underrepresentation for our diverse gifted learners. And we reach in and provide some very specific supports in terms of professional development, unique opportunities with testing to make sure that we're meeting those schools' needs. And then I mentioned this earlier, but this is something obviously I'm collaborating with your office on. We have a verification process. So in LAUSD, you don't have to be identified as gifted to access a GATE program. You can be verified as demonstrating critical thinking and problem-solving skills in your primary language, even if you've never been formally assessed or identified as gifted, because we do want to make sure that all types of gifted learners, not just those who have scored well on a test or are currently high achieving, have access to our programs. So, the bottom line is that, we want to eliminate any roadblocks to our diverse gifted learners accessing any of our GATE programs.
And we all know that research shows that screening every child produces more equitable outcomes. You mentioned my office, which is the Magnet office. So is there a difference between the instructional program at a school for advanced studies and a gifted magnet?
Yeah, so we get this question all the time, so much so that we've created a little infographic on our website to explain the difference. And, most people who are following this podcast know, the purpose of a magnet program. But a magnet program, was designed for integration. A Schools for Advanced Studies was designed as a demonstration site at a resident school. But in terms of the instructional program, in terms of the criteria for students, these should be not only similar, they should be identical. Because basically what you're doing is making sure students who are either identified, meet test score criteria, or demonstrate those critical thinking and problem-solving skills in their primary language have access to these programs. And then you are taking that core curriculum and you're differentiating it with depth, complexity, novelty, and acceleration. So I always tell families from a family perspective or a student perspective, you shouldn't see much of a difference between a gifted magnet and SAS. The students' needs are going to be met in both of those programs. The difference is sort of, why and how they were created and the office that oversees them.
Great, thank you. So what challenges do you face in maintaining and expanding GATE services?
This is a good question because obviously you could ask this question and the easy answer, people will talk about, funding or support or lack of personnel. But I really feel like the biggest hurdle for us is addressing the misconception people have about gifted learners and who they are and what they need. So, as I stated before, a lot of times people conflate giftedness with performance. So giftedness is not the same thing as performance. Gifted learners, again, can be able underachieving, multilingual, twice exceptional. We need to make sure all of those students are accessing our GATE programs. A lot of times people will look at their assessment data and they think, oh, these students scored in the green. These must be our gifted learners. No, those are only your high-achieving learners. Your gifted learners may not be achieving. They may have other needs, and we need to make sure all of those students are accessing all of our programs. So, yeah, our biggest challenge is just getting people to realize who our gifted learners are. And not only instructionally, also in terms of their social emotional needs, and realizing that our gifted learners have these heightened social emotional needs, and they need settings, they need instructional opportunities, they need highly trained teachers to meet their needs in order for them to be successful. A gifted learner is not necessarily going to be successful unless they get these special supports. Again, it's a myth that a gifted learner is going to be fine on their own. They absolutely are not. They need these specialized supports.
I'm glad you mentioned settings because one of the challenges that I experienced when I was a gifted teacher is that my principal, my administrator, was very uncomfortable with walking into my classroom because I termed my classroom as organized confusion or controlled chaos. All the kids were doing a lot of different things, and they're up and walking and moving around. And the principal and my mentor teacher couldn't handle that. And so that was my personal challenge.
I'm glad you're saying that because I think everybody needs to hear this. I think teachers and leaders need to see this. A quiet classroom does not mean it's an engaged, classroom of students. I love the idea of that controlled chaos. We want our students to be talking. I mean, we wonder why we have issues with encouraging academic discourse. A lot of times it's because we have so much control in the classroom that our students aren't given the opportunity to really talk and share and be themselves. Only when we let them do that is when the learning and the critical thinking happens. So, you got to set those expectations, not just for, your administrators, but also for families, because they may walk in the room and be like, whoa, this place is a little wild. But that's where the real learning is happening. It may be in the classroom, it may be on the yard, it may be in, the garden, it may be all over your campus. You want to see that real learning happen. I would say be nervous. If you walk in and they're just silent, they're probably not really thinking and engaged the way that they need to be. We want to see that messiness in the classroom. That shows that they are actually thinking and learning and growing.
Great. Okay, my final question before we get to the speed round. What's the next big thing in gifted intelligent education?
Okay, so I can say the next big thing for LAUSD Gifted Talented programs is our GATE Student Advisory Council. So we piloted it 2 years ago. Last year we launched it with a group of high schoolers. And this year I feel like we've really found our legs with this, where we have about 50 high school students representing gifted identifications and verifications and different programs from around the district. And this GATE Student Advisory Council is planning our first annual student-led conference this year. We're super excited about it. We have released the reins, and they've created committees. They're the ones in charge of planning the keynote and the food and the breakout sessions and designing T-shirts and bags. It is an incredible thing when you actually let your students guide your work. I think it's so important that all of us not just pay lip service to, we do this for our students, we listen to our students. When you actually listen to your students, they may not say things that you want to hear, but we have to face these realities and address their actual experiences, and then tweak our policies and our practices to actually meet their needs. That's the only way we're going to make this work for our students. So yeah, our next big thing right now is our GATE Student Advisory Council. So if any of you guys are listening right now, shout out to you.
Well, that's exciting because the Magnet office, we are piloting our Student Advisory Council, and it's modeled after yours. So thank you for that.
Of course. I hope we can work together.
We always do. Okay, so we like to finish each podcast with like a speed round. So we have 3 questions. Emphasis on speed round. Number 1, what is one book that all educators should read?
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 answers, but I'll talk fast to make it a speed round.
You are a gifted /learner.
So anything by Dr. Donna Ford. So I think it's really important to recognize the history that we have in terms of equitable access to gifted education, and Dr. Donna Ford is the most important scholar in that area. And then the other one that I feel like everybody should read now is The Anxious Generation. That may be unpopular for some, but I think it's just a really important book. I have more answers, but I know this is a speed round.
This is a speed round. Number 2, what do you do for self-care?
That's a good one. So I'll say this, I work extremely long hours and I have 2 middle school students myself. So self-care is, I don't want to say it's a joke, but I have learned how to find beauty and joy in mundane moments. I think that's the only way to really have self-care when you have a very busy lifestyle. So I love to sing, and so I make sure on my commute or when I'm folding laundry, I'm singing. I like to take, long walks to get a loaf of bread. I mean, little things I try to find joy in, and that is my self-care. It's not very fancy, but it works.
And finally, what inspirational quote do you live by?
So I don't know if this is a quote that's going to be on a T-shirt or something, but I would say everyone needs to find sort of what drives them, what their core values are, and every choice they make needs to be driven by those values, and every action they take needs to reflect those core values. I try to do that every day. I think that's what builds trust with people. It shows your integrity. But yeah, I think just really identifying your core values is the most important thing. Yeah, that's a lot to put on a T-shirt, but
that will not fit front and back. Well, thank you, Erin. I appreciate it. I think the audience is much smarter now about gifted and talented education after listening to this podcast, and we do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
As we wrap up today's insightful discussion on gifted education, I'd like to summarize a couple of key topics. Mainly, the importance of nurturing gifted students goes beyond providing advanced academic opportunities and the need to break down the one gifted archetype. Reaching and challenging the gifted learner is about recognizing their diverse needs, from social-emotional support to intellectual challenges that foster creativity and critical thinking. Gifted learners are not always apparent as they display a variety of traits. Some of these characteristics can include a need for precision and justice, divergent interest and responses, a tendency to hold themselves and others to high expectations, a strong sense of curiosity, and a quirky sense of humor. Districts struggle with properly identifying students. Some educators feel that only the students accelerating in academics and quote-unquote behave properly are gifted. That one gifted archetype idea is a fallacy, when in reality, there are numerous gifted underachieving learners and gifted students that present with challenging behaviors that are unidentified. The journey of a gifted student can be complex, but by creating environments that encourage curiosity, resilience, and individuality, we can help them thrive both inside and outside the classroom. Until next time, be safe.